Welcome to the Restoring Our City podcast. We are excited to bring you another episode in our series called Critically Thinking About Blank. And we are going to be bringing you new topics to critically think about, specifically on topics that are very polarizing in our culture. And I've got my fellow co-host here, Jeswin Thomas. Hello, sir.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going good. I think we've got a fun one to talk about today. We want to critically think about something that's very important to all of us,
hmm
and it is about getting married. Critically
Ooh,
thinking about finding the one.
the
And
one.
yes, it's like the Matrix, right? Um, like I think in our South Asian culture, uh, finding the one is it's one of those key milestones in your life. And sometimes folks get pressured on. And one method to find the one is through arranged marriages.
Hmm.
What do you think about that, Jeswin?
Honestly, Joby, I haven't thought about it just because we live out here in America, and I'm in this premarital season for those of you that don't know. And I went the route of swiping using the app game and finding someone through that, dating and engaged now.
Shout
But
out
I've
Stephanie.
never,
And
yeah, shout out to Stephanie, but never really considered arranged marriage by any means.
yeah, it's interesting in our culture, in our South Asian culture, especially because of this recent show a couple months ago that was all the rage. What is it? Indian
hmm
matchmaking.
Indian matchmaking.
And I think just I know there's probably folks who are listening out there who might be in this season, and your parents are like sending you random photos of people, right?
hmm
So we wanted to actually, how do we critically think about this topic specifically? Critically thinking about getting married and looking at arranged marriage critically, right? Are there some
Yeah.
pros and cons, and how does that work? So before we even get into this topic, Jeswin, how do we critically think about things? I know we talked about a framework during our original episode. Can you kind of remind our listeners, how do you critically think about a topic?
Yeah. For those of you that have been following along, this might be familiar to you. But Jobin and I kind of sat down and we were thinking just about that topic about how do we critically think. And the framework that we're going to be using is, first off, just outlining what is our idea or question. And today we're going to be thinking about arranged marriages. What are the opinions, different opinions about this topic? What are the assumptions that go into these opinions? And are there objective measures that either support those opinions or go against those opinions? And then finally, what are some implications for going one way or another with the opinion? And finally, kind of what's our personal take on this? So I'm excited and kind of curious to see how this all kind of goes.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you too. So feel free to throw us an anonymous question on our website. You can ask us anything. There's a link to that. Just drop an anonymous question, or if you're brave and you want to send us a recording, leave us a message as well. We'd be happy to throw that on the podcast too. But all right, so we're talking critically thinking about arranged marriages, and so
Mhm.
their opinions, and I think there's generational opinions as well. So what are some of those opinions of getting married out there?
Right. So what's funny with arranged marriages? I think the initial thought is this is something that is forced upon you, right? Like two people, your parents and another set of parents are just choosing who you're going to marry. And at the same time, Indian matchmaking sort of for the Western world maybe broke down some of those views and it's like, hey, there's a matchmaker and you still kind of have a choice,
Yeah.
even when you go through this process. And then secondly, the another opinion here is arranged marriages are the best method to find success in a relationship. And maybe, some of the people like our parents in an older generation from the eastern side of the world do hold to that pretty strongly.
Yeah, that's totally true. And they might feel like this is the only way, and this is the only way that we
hmm
got married. So it's going to work for you. Right. But let's look at some of the numbers too. Right. So
Sure.
in some articles out there, it says 55% of marriages that happen across the globe today are
Hmm.
arranged marriages. So we're
That
talking
is, yeah. What's funny
volume.
is sometimes we live in this bubble over here. It's like, oh, everyone's just dating and finding marriage, but hey, we're the minority here.
Yeah, exactly. Right. We are the minority. So it's really interesting. And I think maybe our parents and different cultures have some weight behind that because they can throw a lot of stats at us. I think we are all very familiar when we talk about the
Hmm.
divorce rate, especially in the US, right? Like half of marriages don't continue. And
Yeah.
in specifically in India, according to some articles, in India, the rate of arranged marriage is 90%. So some countries more than other.
Wow.
This is the way, right? This is how
Hmm.
you do it. So yeah, is there any kind of weight to that where when we're talking to our parents that this is the best way to do it because of look at the numbers, just look at the data.
That's interesting because at first glance, that's incredible. If we're talking about these stats and these numbers, that is on the surface, just an achievement in and of itself. But Jobin and I, once again, we were trying to dig into this just a little bit more. And so, what are some other things that we've thought about when it comes to just beyond the surface? What do we actually see? And one is, well, what is actually the divorce rate between arranged marriages, right? And
Right.
surprisingly, it's only 6.3%
Yeah.
of marriages globally. And so, digging into a little bit further, it seems even better than before.
It's like waving those stats at us. But again, we're critically thinking about these things, right? We can't just look at numbers or look at some articles on face value. We need to dig into some of these assumptions and analyze some of these things. And so when we look at some of these opinions, what are some of the underlying assumptions that maybe both sides are making? Are there some assumptions from folks who think arranged marriage is great, and then maybe some people who think it's horrible and the worst thing ever?
Yeah, Joby, when I think about arranged marriage on the surface, I think one assumption that I make is, hey, I'm not actually marrying someone that I'm gonna like. Just if I think about it, I feel like I am different from my parents. So to imagine them choosing somebody is a pretty scary prospect here.
Yeah.
I'm actually marrying someone that I'm gonna love. But do you have any assumptions that come to your mind?
Oh, it's interesting. We just had dinner with a family who was not South Asian, and we were talking about you know um, arranged marriage actually, and it's kind of like how our parents met, and they're like, oh, they only met each other like once or twice,
Hmm.
and it was interesting, and they automatically were like so dismissive of it, and I thought about that. I was like, well, no, there's still some value to it, right? So I think there is being born and brought up here and I'm married, it's going on 6 years now. It's like, yeah, I wanted to choose a person that I had a lot of things in common, but I'm not going to dismiss arranged marriage because I feel like there's so many components to the searching process that I thought were really valuable. So I
Mhm.
think there's some assumptions that people just think it's like forced, and maybe that's not totally 100% true. So yeah, so I think there's some assumptions on both sides, and sometimes we turn our ear away from some of these things. But okay, so now we got to look at some of the objective measures, right? For these opinions and maybe against these opinions as well. So, kind of looking at it, I think we talked about the global volume of arranged marriages. I mean, it's a huge percentage when we talk about 55% of marriages across the world are arranged marriages. It's interesting in this another article in 2012, it cites this research that 74% of respondents in a survey conducted in India
Mhm.
approved of arranged marriage and prefer it over, and this is a quote from the article, freely chosen marriage,
Hmm.
end quote. So it seems like overwhelmingly that's the methodology that folks in India prefer to choose.
All right.
Compared to here, it's kind of like an anomaly, right? How do we look at some of these things? I think we talk about the divorce rate, and that's kind of the glaring one, right? Like why
Mhm.
people are like, hey, yeah, just the Western way of dating and just finding the person on your own and letting your heart flutter. Maybe that's maybe that's not the best way to go about it because of look at these statistics. How do you feel about that when we look at some of those numbers, and because we're clearly not doing it that way, right?
Right. I guess there's always more than meets the eye, and in some things that Jobin and I kind of talked about, and even saw was an article cited that even though the divorce rate might be low in the 6%, there's married but essentially separated, and that's almost double of that percentage. And so when you start putting those pieces together, maybe it isn't as rosy as it may seem.
That's very true. There's a really great article that talked about this term called the invisible divorce, which is, I quote from this article in ED Times, a website in India. that says, I quote, invisible divorce is a tortured cohabitation of a couple in a relationship that has irrevocably fallen apart, end
Hmm.
quote. So
Yeah.
there's this culture or stigma of like, hey, I got to stay together because I got to stay together, even though we're not completely happy with each other.
Right. And even if we start thinking about, Eastern cultures in general, so much of what defines you is sort of your status in society, and just about that culture of having sort of an honor and shame sort of paradigm, right? That it is so distressing for not just you, but the shame that it'll bring on your family if you end up separating, and that sometimes is not the best reason to keep people together, and it may inflate some of these stats.
Yeah, very true. That's really important because we can't just look at stats and say this is the best way and this is the worst way, but we
Right.
have to kind of look at the context around it. Um, and I think there's a real difference between the Eastern world and the Western world, right?
Absolutely.
Specifically, I think we were talking a little bit about this before, but when it comes to our faith as well, right? Like our faith plays a huge role when it comes to relationships.
Hmm.
How does that impact kind of the difference between what we see in the Western world versus the Eastern world's approach to marriage?
Absolutely. And once again, sometimes when we even talk about the term faith, it may be nominal, and it might be more just sort of a social thing that we adhere to.
Yeah.
However, at the same time, I think, every religion within this world would sort of affirm the idea of marriage, and really the family unit, and keeping things together for your children, for the future. There's sort of this sort of triangle, right? Like sometimes we hear it within Christianity and our parents, like yourself, your spouse, and God kind of form this circle together. And that principle is not just within Christianity, but just in general in the Eastern world. And when we were looking into some statistics, especially brought to us by Statista here, only about 21% of people in the Eastern world do not affiliate with the religion. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean all of them don't believe in God. So, if you take the other 80% plus some of this, you see a high percentage of people actually having that a faith of some sorts.
Yeah. And that plays a role when you're trying to find a partner to live the rest of your life with. And I think you talked about it like being the building block of society, right? Like
Hmm.
and just valuing relationships that way. So we're looking at some of these statistics, we're looking at some of the opinions for and against, and there's underlying assumptions in these things. So we can't really just throw away one way or the other. We've got to critically
Right.
think through these decisions.
Hmm.
So um what are some of those factors that we have to take a look at? Maybe that arranged marriages take a look at. I mean,
Yeah.
from our friends and family, what have you heard? What do they take a look at?
What's interesting is with the concept of arranged marriage, it's almost the meeting of two families kind of coming together, right? And what's so interesting about that idea, and Jobin could probably affirm that for me, is I'm probably the least objective person when it comes to myself. What I
Yeah,
like, or what I want, what I think is good for me, and I've learned that from failure and from experiences, right? Like I can't discount that from myself. So I need people in my life, and Jobin is definitely one of them here, but others too that need to keep me in check and really, kind of sit through and critically analyze myself so that I can also objectively see, hey, is this something I actually want or not? And with arranged marriages, it's interesting that the people that are thinking about your marriage most critically is your family. And that is,
yeah,
I think, a very good thing.
yeah. It is a good thing, and maybe there is some merit to these matchmakers.
Sure.
That is really interesting. I sat through some of those episodes of Indian Matchmaker. I cannot promise that I watched all of it, but it was interesting to say the least. I think there's another show. I haven't seen it, but I've heard about
Mhm.
it. Married at First Sight. And I actually read this article about this person, this psychologist, who actually said this. I quote, the biggest lesson I learned from my experience as a matchmaker of arranged marriages on Married at First Sight and the extensive study and research into commitment She says, I believe that the success of many arranged marriages comes down to each individual prioritizing commitment to the marriage and relationship itself above all else. End quote.
Mm.
So there's this like, okay, if they commit to each other and they love each other, but then there's this outside party looking at all the factors to kind of put them together. But it's only going to be successful if we work at it together, right? Regardless of how you
Absolutely.
arrive together, it's working at it together once you're in the relationship. So,
Yeah, and even when I think about our parents, many of our parents, my parents, Jobin's parents included in this, they're not unhappily married. Even though they might have been arranged and they came together. I think part of that is thinking just like that article said, right? Like, how do I sort of prioritize this above myself? And literally, when we think about this more so from a Christian perspective, that idea of dying to myself and my desires in order to benefit someone else is that picture of Christ toward us, right? And so, to be able to do that within a marriage rather than going into it with the mentality of how do I maximally get someone that's most compatible with me, so I have to change the least, maybe that doesn't drive long-term success
ooh,
here.
yeah, that's a great way to look at it, especially when we bring our faith into it and the values and
Hmm.
things that we hold dear. I think our wives and fiancés are going to love this episode to hear us say this. But at the same time, it's going to be like, you don't do that all the time, and it's
Hmm.
it's a work, it's an effort, and it's definitely, it takes some time and commitment, and it's not always rosy. And I'm thinking about this too as we talk about this, Jessamine. It's kind of like we're not trying to come to this conclusion to say, hey, all of you who've been rejecting all those pictures your parents have been sliding underneath your door to like give it a chance, maybe. But it's also like, just don't dismiss something just because you think it's a horrible method and it just doesn't
Mm.
work because you live in
Hmm.
America. Or I think for the parents who might be listening to this, or from the older folks in a different culture, hey, I mean, finding the person you share great values with and that you actually do have some chemistry with goes a long way as well to build that commitment.
Yeah.
So I guess when it comes to our faith and like making that personal conclusion, I think we've made our conclusions already personally when it comes
Sure.
to this subject specifically. Um, but how do you kind of arrive after you've looked at the data? What's kind of your personal feelings on an approach, and maybe how you think about arranged marriages?
It's so hard to to say one method is the way that we should go. But, honestly, after kind of thinking about arranged marriages and looking at it together, there's some principles here that I think are extremely applicable in both contexts. I think one is, prioritizing your values, your faith, your outlook on life more than maybe personality features, right? Like maybe we shouldn't be pursuing just the person that looks the best, is the funniest, maybe those aren't the qualities we should be considering, whereas our parents and or matchmakers might consider values, might consider faith, will definitely consider, hey, what is the family that you're marrying sort of into, right? Like what beliefs do they also hold, and what kind of structure does that kind of give toward yourself and your family? I think that's a huge component. And then two, more specifically, that mentality, what mentality are we actually taking into even considering dating someone, right? Is it really the let me change the least so that I can benefit the most? Or is it really going to be the mentality of like, hey, if we're really going to be called to marriage, how do I have the mentality to be willing to die to myself the most for the benefit of this other person, and more specifically for the glory of God in our marriage?
And that's words of wisdom right there. I feel like those kind of nuggets are going to help you 10, 15, 20 years down the road when you're actually going through life together, right? Not, is he tall? Is he super funny? Does he go out? Like, these are some of the things that I hear younger folks can be like, I need to find somebody who just goes out all the time. I'm like, well, how's that going to help you in the 30 years?
Yeah. And what's really funny about that, Jobin, is for all our listeners out there, I have no idea what marriage is gonna hold. I'm gonna get married in a couple months here. And honestly, if you talk to Stephanie, my fiance, we could not be more opposite on any of our likes or interests, right? I think, like when it comes to our opinions on having a pet, whether it comes to our opinions on nature versus wanting to travel and look at big cities, we could not be more opposite. One's more of a social butterfly, one's a little bit more of a introvert and a homebody. But surprisingly, talking about those principles, we came together mostly because of our shared interest in our faith and our values in terms of serving Christ and His kingdom, and even within our mentalities and outlook for, hey, what do we think about, thinking about a family one day, and what do we feel like we should be valuing going into the future when it comes to finances and different areas of that nature. So once again, I have no idea what marriage is going to hold, and you probably could give viewers a lot better insight into that, even
Yep.
despite the limited experience here. But at the same time, I hope that I honored at least the process a little bit with looking at that.
I was I'm preparing to actually speak at a wedding in several months, and it's funny. I'm like, okay, I've been only married for 6 years. I can't give advice,
Whew.
and I still hold that. I can't give advice. I don't think in 15, 20 years. But what I can do is look to the perfect example of a relationship, which is Christ, right? Like how he
Mm,
treated us as his bride, and I think that's the best way I could think of it, because like I don't know how marriage is going to look like. Okay, I got a young son, all right, and that changes the dynamic of our
mm,
relationship, and
mhm.
then where you live and your job, and there's so many factors, but it's like, man, it always comes back to like, how does Jesus treat us, and how did he pursue us?
Yeah.
um I heard you gave a great best man speech a couple of weekends ago.
Oh, thank you.
um
Appreciate it.
yeah, and I think you summed it up so well, Jeswin, when you talked about how Jesus gave us, if you didn't, yeah, for those of you who weren't there at this wedding that I'm just referring to randomly, Jeswin gave this great best man speech, and you talked about how Jesus gave us 100% when we were giving zero, right? And I think sometimes we think of marriage as this 50-50 split, when
Mm.
it's really portraying how Jesus sacrificed himself for us when we didn't even care. And so, man, if we can have that approach to marriage, I think we're going to be on the right track.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, Jessamine, I think this is a great way to critically think about arranged marriages. And I think getting married in general, which is always a hot topic for our society and culture today. So, um, let us know how that works out for you guys. For those of you listening, I know it's a fun topic to kind of talk through, but Jessamine, thank you so much for jumping on this episode and talking about this, and looking forward to critically thinking about a lot more our society has to offer.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.